Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Sporting Global podcast. And today I'm here with a very good friend and my former professor from the University of San Francisco, Dr. Nola Agha. And Nola, it's a pleasure having you here. Thanks for taking the time.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's so great to come back and have a conversation with you.
Likewise, Nola. And for those of you, that are tuning in, if you want key tips from leaders like Nola every week, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the YouTube channel, and we will have people from all over the world sharing their tips and insights. But Nola, first and foremost, I gotta say, I miss California, especially now being being in cold Norway over the last 2 years and not being able to travel. How's life in San Francisco and California these days?
It's really good. We are certainly at that point in the pandemic where things are changing, and so people's attitudes are changing.
Yeah.
But California is, of course, California, which is beautiful and fun, a diverse, excellent place of, I don't know, just a mix of a variety of people that are always entrepreneurial and always trying new things, and at the same time, kick back and relaxed. So anyway, I grew up here. It's the perfect environment for me. It's that great combination of I don't know, people who are just looking forward focused, but also relaxed at the same time. So we got to get here. We got to get you in California for a while when it's safe.
Yeah, no, like it's definitely one of the first places I'm gonna go to once it opens up. Like San Francisco is kind of like my second home, and I miss that. And I think you're pretty spot on. It sort of like has that nice mix of like that, chill vibe, but also that entrepreneurial and innovative spirit. And I think that sums up California and particularly San Francisco in a very good nutshell. And I must admit, missing the Land's End, one of my favorite trails, going there. And I guess maybe in the podcast I have to add like some photos and maybe some stuff from this so people know what we're actually talking about. But nonetheless, I think we have to kind of like start a little bit from the beginning, of like how did your journey essentially begin in the sport industry, and I guess as well like where did sort of like your passion for educating sports also start? How did that come to life?
That's a great question. So I think, like most people, I started, or my passion started because I was an athlete. I competed, I was a runner. I loved what I did. I loved being around sport. I loved being on the track. And so that felt like a very natural place for me. It was a passion that I had. So I went off to school thinking I was going to be a sport medicine doctor and studied exercise physiology, and very quickly realized that wasn't what I wanted to do.
Right.
And my degree in exercise physiology, very quickly realized there was no jobs that I could get with that degree that I really wanted. And that's when my journey really took a shift. And that's when I discovered the management side of sport.
Right.
Discovered that actually in the USF sport management program. I decided to do a master's degree in sport management. And during the program, I took a class in econ and finance. And I read 2 books that changed my life. And those were books that were focused on, well, like I said, econ and finance. And
Yeah.
And I just realized that light bulb went off in my head, and I said, this is what I want to do forever. And partially because it was the first time that I saw math being applied to sport. And so this last century, this was last millennia, this was like the 1990s. And so it was before Moneyball. It was before analytics really were playing a really large role in sport business. And so there was very few applications at that time of anything computational or mathematical in sport. And that's what I wanted to do. And I don't think I realized it until I read it and I saw it, but I'd always loved math. And so I saw that and was like, oh, if I can do econ and apply it to sport, then that sounds perfect. And so that's really where my career kind of took off from there.
Yeah.
So that was important. And it's interesting, you ask about being in the sport industry, and you ask about education. And I think that's a really important distinction. So in some ways, I almost don't feel like higher education is part of the sport industry. Of course, I teach about the sport industry. Sure. And so that's kind of separate. So what I did is I worked for a while in econ and finance in the sport world and loved what I did, but there wasn't a lot of full-time jobs. And so I went away and I worked in international business for a while. And when I came back to the US, I realized that I really missed sport and I really wanted to do more of it. And again, it's still pre-Moneyball. And so at that time, it was was like, well, what do I do? I'd always felt like I needed more computational skills. And so a PhD made a lot of sense.
Mm.
At the same time, I always wanted to be a teacher when I was a kid.
Yeah.
Mom was a teacher. My heroes when I were growing up were my teachers. All the people I looked up to were my teachers.
Right.
And so it was a really natural fit that
Yeah.
a PhD would allow me to get these more computational skills to do more advanced things that I wanted to do. At the same time, being a teacher, because for those of you that don't know, when you have a PhD and you work in a university, you basically have two jobs. That's to teach and it's to research.
Right.
So what I realized is both of my passions could be achieved if I went back and got a PhD.
Yeah. So I guess like you talked a lot about sort of like that light bulb, you know, sort of like one was obviously, you know, okay, I want to work in sports, and like I think everyone that, you know, are in the sport industry is like start as either like a fan or like an athlete, or at some point it's sort of like, okay, at some point it shifts, you know, from being like a fan to like a professional. And I guess like that's one of the key things of the program as well. And I guess that sort of like was an eye opener for you, as well, going back to like, okay, now I could finally like, you know, take that econ and finance towards sports. And as you said, sort of like already at that point starting to utilizing, you know, the financial numbers and structure up towards sports. And you know how important that is today. So I guess like you're part of that process though, on the journey. And I guess that must kind of be exciting as well, you know, to be part of.
It is. And I think anytime somebody discovers what they really want to do, when they discover their passion,
Yeah.
like that's just a moment where after that, the decisions that you make in terms of your career become much easier because you have a sense of what your path is going to be. And before that, it can feel very meandering in terms of maybe I hear a lot of times from students, oh, I like these 5 things. And, you know, they'll rattle off 5 completely different things.
Right.
And that's it's totally great to love 5 different things. I love way more than 5 different things. At some point, you're going to find that one thing where you're like, oh, I really, really like this one. And so until you find it, you sometimes need to meander and try a whole bunch of different options.
Right. And I mean, like, yeah, and that's part of the journey too, as well, as you said, of like, okay, you did like, you know, the education that you did like before the sport management program, and said like, okay, that's what you thought you wanted to do. And like once you're in there as well, you sort of like realize, well, actually that's not for me. And I think like sport management, and if we just talk about that in general, it's just like a pool of opportunities, right? And a lot of people are like, you know, especially in the US, like, okay, it's professional teams or college athletics, and then there's like so much more in the scope of sports and sport management that you can do. And I guess like a lot of the job here is to like, how do we open those eyes? And I guess like, you know, from you now though, that have been part, you know, as a professor, as part of the USF sport management program for over 10 years now, you know, like it's a nice staple to have in your belt, I would guess. And if you could like, I mean, this is probably like a super hard question, but at the same time, I thought it's important if you like, what are some of the key highlights and experience you witness, I guess, from your students along the way? Because I think you've been in a very fascinating time of sports, you know, especially now as well with the pandemic. And is there something like that you're like, these are some key moments that I remember, you know, from these 10 years?
Oh wow, that's really hard. Actually really, really tough. In some ways I feel like it's asking me to pick like my favorite kid. You know, I can't do that. It's not allowed. You're not allowed to have a favorite when you've got kids. And in some ways it's not, you're not allowed to have a favorite when you've got students, because there's so many, and we have these cohorts of students, and we definitely love everything that they've done. But some key highlights, I mean, they certainly always revolve around those students and the experiences that they have and the successes that they have. And they've been all over the place. I'll say generically, it's whenever a student gets their dream job. You know, they graduate and they've had their eye on a target and they've been working towards it. And when they reach that goal, it's just so fulfilling to see that they've really achieved what they wanted to.
Right.
There's been amazing collaborations that we've had. When Super Bowl 50 was hosted in the San Francisco Bay Area, we had an enormous pool of students that were working, volunteering, and interning with the organization. And so they were all able to jumpstart careers in events and event management. They were able to get an enormous amount of experience.
Right.
The students that are currently working for the Olympics, of course, you know, the 2020 and now 2021 Olympics have been quite a roller coaster. I mean, any large event always is, but they've had an additional level of complication.
Yeah.
We've got students working for the Beijing 2022 Olympics in next year. Actually, it's shocking that it's so soon. We got thrown off with this whole delayed summer game. We've got students who have been authors and filmmakers and have gone on to get their PhDs, and then of course entrepreneurs, the students who come back 2 or 3 years later and they say, hey, can I have a conversation? I've got this idea, and we'll sit down and we'll talk through something and we'll work through a project. So like that's amazing. Foundations, a lot of students have gone out and started nonprofits and foundations that support youth sport. So I don't know, are those highlights or is that just an enormous list? I'm not sure, but there's so many to name, and it's those successes that are really the highlight.
Yeah, I mean, like I would definitely call that highlights for sure, because there's such variety, and I guess like you've been seeing it kind of like over the 10 years, that like all the different paths and journeys that your students has taken. I guess that must be a quite a fun experience and journey to be part of, and just like witnessing that and say like, hey, I was part of that, and could help, like help them in that direction. So I miss that's sort of like the joy, I guess, in a sense of being a teacher and a professor, if I'm not wrong. But obviously, if we dive a little bit into like some of the classes that you're teaching right now, one of them, of course, being the quantitative analysis, which is one of the first classes in the program, and then of course, I guess one of the last one in the program as well is the strategic management, and I guess like if you could give us an overview of like what are some of the key elements that you're covering in each class, and I guess like touch a little bit into the previous question of how is it to see sort of like the growth of your students from like that early class to like when they're reaching the strategic management, because that's if I'm not mistaken almost like 6, 7, 8 months difference in time span, so a lot of happens in 6, 7 months.
Absolutely. So let's break it down. Let's start with the quantitative analysis.
Do
And
it.
so this is a really fun course. Actually, I just finished teaching it a couple days ago.
Yep.
It's really about quantitative reasoning. And the reason is most people, especially from an American background and maybe globally as well, but most people are afraid of numbers. They've had bad experiences in math class. They've had horrible math teachers, and they see something with numbers and they freeze or they
Yeah.
stress out. And it's something they dislike. Inherently, there's just something inside that makes them uneasy.
Right.
And my goal in 8 weeks is to turn that upside down and to see if I'm able to not be afraid of numbers and not hate numbers. But the reality is this, the students did informational interviews. So they did 66 different informational interviews in that 8-week period, total among the whole class. 97% of the people they talked to who work in the sport industry in every possible career that you could think of, 97% said that they use numbers at work all the time.
There you go.
All the time being kind of like a vague phrase, but every job is different. Sure. So even if you're doing logistics for game operations, you're looking at, well, what happened last time we ran this promotion? Which gate should we open? How many bobbleheads do we need? People are looking at budgets. People are analyzing data. Regardless of what your job is, you're doing something with data. And that's really eye-opening for students to realize they're going to have to use numbers. They don't have to love them, right, but they have to know how to use them. They have to know how to interpret them. So we start from kind of like step one, which is learning how to analyze the numbers ourselves, right, and then interpret it and then make decisions from it. And that's really the critical part, because you're going to have to be making decisions based on numbers for the rest of your career. But then move on to like, what if somebody's giving you numbers? How do you then question them? Well, like, where did these numbers come from?
Right.
So can you really understand enough of the back end process, because you've done the back end process, to when you're a manager and somebody's handing you reports? Yep. Can you really make sure that the reports they're handing you that you're about to make a decision to base your career off of,
right,
are good? So we really walk through that whole gamut, and it's amazing to see the transformation in such a short period of time. And so it's really a skill set. It's an ability that somebody can walk out of the classroom with.
Right.
Now, as you mentioned, strategic management is much later. For some cohorts, it's a year later. For others, it's closer to 8 months.
Yep.
And for those students, strategic management is completely different. Strategic management is about I use the analogy of a chessboard. You know, when it's a game
Yeah.
and you're way up above it and you're looking down on it and you're seeing how those pieces are moving. How are people competing? How are businesses competing with each
Mm,
other? How are they moving to outmaneuver each other? How are they trying to strike each other down? But in
right.
order to understand the game, you have to be above it and not
Yeah.
in it. And so by in it, I mean, often we go to our work every day and our jobs and we go through the minutia, we check our email, we click buttons, we do whatever the minutia of our job is.
Right.
We rarely forget to take that step back and think about, well, what's the whole company doing? What's the business doing? And so now this is thinking like managers. This is thinking like CEOs. And that's a really important skill set to have because, uh, if you want to be a manager at some point, you have to be able to look at a business like that.
Yeah. I can
It's
relate.
totally different.
I can relate a lot, especially as the entrepreneurial journey has been, diving there's a lot of sometimes you get so tunnel vision into like what you're doing that you got to remember to take a step back and see like, okay, but
Mhm.
where did this fit in, and does it actually make sense for whatever goal or vision that company has? And I mean, like, without making this too personal to Sporting Global, I mean, like, for us, it's like we say this with every initiative we do, it has to fit within our pillars. If it doesn't fit in within those, it doesn't make sense for us to do it. So it always have to make sense in that aspect. And every people that are with us, they know that, okay, whatever initiative you come up with, make sure that it fits within those pillars, because then there's a larger chance for us to actually go that route. And then, I mean, like, it's sort of like, what is your ultimate goal, right? Where do you map that out? And it is, as you say, you have to sort of like predict a little bit the future. And in order to do that, you have to sort of like have that, what are we going to call it? Like skybox, skybox view over the mat, and then and sort of like see where the pieces are going. So I think that's a really great analogy, and a
Right.
very
And then
important.
it gets easier for people to do this. So as they're moving through educational journey and they're getting more and more experienced in management and business, that's also where that fun transformation happens from just knowing what skills are, marketing skills or leadership skills or quantitative skills, to be able to start thinking like a manager. So once you build that skill set, then you can kind of start, it's easier to build up into that platform and to
Right.
think bigger picture.
No, for sure. And I guess, although if you look at the sort of like the strategic management class, I mean, like, from my experience as well, it tends to be a little bit entrepreneurial, I guess, in a sense. I don't know if that's still the case, but but I guess that. And how do you, I guess, cater the classes for the rapid changes that are happening in the startup world? Because I mean, like, the decisions there has to be done quite fast, because the ecosystem and the startup life cycle, right? It's like, you're running out of time, you're running out of money. There's always, fast paced elements going on. And I guess, like, how are you catering that with, in terms of the changes, especially during the pandemic and with online classes for you guys too, which I guess was a rapid change that had to happen.
Yeah, there's a lot there to unpack. So let's see. Starting with, what does it mean to stay on top of these rapid changes? And I think the first is always starting with news. So if you're really passionate about the sport industry, you should be connected to some sort of sport business news.
Mm,
And not, it's stay up with the scores, whatever you want to do, but that's very different than staying up with sport business news, because the business news is going to show you that things are changing every single day. There's new partnerships, there's new acquisitions, there's new mergers, there's new divestitures, there's companies going out of business, there's bankruptcies. And that's real business. That happens all the time.
yeah.
So what the pandemic did is, of course, it disrupted business models across the globe, and business models, how a company makes money, who their customers are, and how they're making money. And so I think most people are interested in sport management often will start by thinking about professional sport. Well, when you think about what they did, obviously their customers couldn't show up in person, but a lot of their other business parts of their business model were fully functional. The media
Mm,
contracts, their sponsorships, they were earning money. Now, if you're working in professional sport, you're like, no, it was a disaster. Well,
right.
it was in the sense that the sponsors were receiving less value for what they had paid, and so there's lots of make
Right.
goods that had to happen. Media contracts had to be renegotiated, labor contracts had to be negotiated, but in reality there wasn't an enormous shift in their business model. and so again, it's all about perspective. You know, if you're working in it, you were like, of course it was a nightmare. Everybody had to adapt though, but they still had the exact same customer groups that they did before. They had the fans that were willing to come in person or to pay to be on a Zoom. They had their sponsors, they had their media contracts. They just had to have a different way of doing business.
Right.
It's very different than the disruption that of the pandemic that fostered new innovation.
Right.
And these were the companies that came in and said, oh, people can't go to the gym. Let me make an at-home solution, or let me make an app, a fitness app, where somebody pays me, $10 a month and they can get unlimited, I don't know, aerobics classes or, something like that.
Right.
So much innovation on that front. And so that's what we're looking at in terms of, and again, that could be app, it could be service-based businesses, it could be the physical businesses, the Peloton and all of their competitors that started launching new products, physical products for people to work out at home. And of course, now that the pandemic is ending, those businesses are starting to lose sales, and because we're starting to see gyms reopen.
Right.
And that staying on top of what's going on, because business changes every single day, and you have to just completely be on top of it.
No, 100%. And I mean, like, and how do you sort of like cater that, I guess, to the classes in strategic management, and making sure that, okay, that we talk about startup ecosystem, right? I think like a lot of the things that we focus on when we're visiting universities and talking for their students is because everyone was like freaking out about opportunities, lack of opportunities, when the pandemic sort of like hit, and everyone's like, well, but there's no games, there's no this, everything stopped. And it's like, but look at all the sectors that are booming, like you look at the esport industry, like nothing really changed. They elevated, they just kept going because all their events was pretty much digital anyways, right? Of course, they were like some in physical, event places, but then they're like, startups coming up, from all over the place and disrupting and changing, sectors. And I guess like, how do you open that mindset for the students that were sort of like, okay, I'm going to work for 49ers and there's no events.
Right. A lot of it is trying to open people's minds to what it actually means to work in the sport industry. I would say the vast majority of people, when you say the word sport industry, imagine professional sport.
Right.
There's so much more to the sport industry, and it can be anything. So we think of professional sport as sport production. You're producing an event, something happening on the field. But that can be college sport, it can be rec sport, it can be youth sport, it could be fitness, it could be what we call sport for good. So using the production of sport for all sorts of social benefit. But every single one of those, and any of those businesses have governing bodies. They have facilities that they work in. They have the physical goods that they need in order to play their sport. They have the media that broadcasts their sport or covers it. They have, and this is where most sport businesses are on actually services, agencies, service providers. So ticketing companies, you can't, any of those live sporting events, those produced events, you can't have without tickets. Most of them need concessions. So these service providers, marketing and advertising and public relations. And then of course, the other really big and growing industry is I mean, I can call it sport tech, but it's really about this combination of how can you use technological solutions to improve any of the processes that we're doing.
Right.
And that's the physical monitors. It's anything that's bio related that we're putting, we've got like swimming goggles where you can, it can digitize like your heart rate and the number of laps you've done. It's just right there in front of your eyeballs. Like, did you know those existed? If you didn't, guess what? Like, there's that equivalent for every single sport on earth. And there's probably 10 different companies that are working on every single different sport. And that's just an example, right? And so the number of apps, the number of physical things that we're doing, there's so much innovation and there's so much change. And they're tiny companies that you've never heard of until you've suddenly heard of them. Like they're there for 5 and 10 years working on these solutions, and and they're at the cusp of nobody knows they exist. And then suddenly somebody buys a Peloton bike and everyone's like, oh, I've heard of this thing called Peloton. Well, guess what? It was there for a long time before that. You just didn't know about it. And same with the goggles. It's the same with your wearable technologies. And And that's the really cool part also about entrepreneurship. So kind of go back to your point of like, how do you bring people's mindset into this? It's just the more you talk about these companies, the more people start to think about what that journey is like.
And I guess that's strategic management 101.
Yeah, it is. It really is.
So obviously, I think we've been touching a lot on some of these subjects already, but we have to talk a little about entrepreneurship, about building a foundation, and of course like what it means being an entrepreneur. And I want to take you a little bit back to after I graduated, and I guess like a year or so after I came back from my first business trip, I guess, for Sporting Global to Cali on my market research trip, and then we had a nice lunch, and we're driving back in the car, and we were talking a lot about like what an entrepreneur is, and I wanted to I wanted to just hear from you like right now, like what is an entrepreneur for you?
It's a big word, isn't it? It means an awful lot of things. And one of the things that I always like to point out is when we hear about entrepreneurs, or if you read about them in newspaper articles that highlight successful companies and successful entrepreneurs,
Right.
the thing you've heard about them is that those people have persisted. Right. It's all the ones that quit along the way that we never hear about because they're no longer in business and they're no longer doing their work. So to me, an entrepreneur is somebody who's very persistent.
Yeah.
That's a characteristic. I think more importantly, what inspires somebody to become an entrepreneur is because they see a problem and they see a solution.
Right.
And I honestly, I think of you as the perfect example, because I remember you were a student in the program.
Yeah.
These services that help you find jobs, they're horrible. Their user interfaces are ugly. And I
Didn't work.
Yeah, you said there's a way better way to do this. And then that's what you did. Like, so you saw that problem. You said, well, I can solve that.
Yeah.
So I think at its core, that's truly what an entrepreneur is.
Well, I mean, like, I wanted to bring up this story because it's something that is so personal to me, because I think a lot of people has like this perspective of an entrepreneur, and you talk about like it's a big word, right? It's something that has like so many like there's so many things around it that people expect, kind of like they have like this set framework of what an entrepreneur is. And even myself, I was like telling you in the car, I was like, I'm not an entrepreneur. I don't see myself as an entrepreneur. And because like as along with a lot of people, we were just thinking, that an entrepreneur, it's just this typical person who's always been, innovative, always wanted to like, I'm going to start my own business. Or like I started selling ice cream at the beach when I was like, 12, 14 years old. And that's great. But I was never there. And I think there's a lot of people that, have never been in that sort of bubble, but then there's this, idea or concept or problem that people see. And what really stuck to me was that sort of like the way where you, of course, talking about persistent, but that an entrepreneur is someone that, sees that problem, but actually does something about it. And we were all talking about it in the car. We were talking about it later as well. And like, everybody saw the problem, but nobody was really doing anything about it. And I said like, okay, I'm going to be the one to do it. And I think that's where the persistent card comes in, I guess, where you have to say that, okay, I'm going to be the one doing it. And then you keep doing it until you make it happen. And that's quite a journey, but I really appreciate the kind words and letting you know that conversation, alongside with, of course, like all of our others, it was very important for me, for just kind of like justifying what an entrepreneur was, and sort of like me also standing behind that and proudly kind of like saying like I am an entrepreneur, like, because this is what it is and I can relate to that. And because you see this a lot in the startup world, and I think a lot of people are, I don't know, I wouldn't say afraid, but it's sort of like that impression that in order to be a successful entrepreneur, you almost have to be a serial entrepreneur, and you have to have done this, and you have to have sold the company, you have to done, but everyone starts at zero. Like we have had people comparing us to LinkedIn, and I said like, well, they started at 0 users too. You got to start somewhere. And it takes time, and then it's about, taking that step. But first step for me was sort of like vouching and being clear about, okay, I I am an entrepreneur, and people can realizing that is not just that typical impression that a lot of people had, and that means a lot to me.
Well, it was fantastic. I love having these conversations. And like I had said earlier, it's always fantastic when somebody comes back, even a couple years later. And man, I remember one person came back, I don't know, 2, 3 years later, just said, I have this idea. What can we do? And we had a fantastic conversation. And guess what? She's got a really successful company now. And so, sometimes it's just having those conversations with somebody that can help inspire you. And sometimes that's all we need is that little inspiration or that little push to
Yep.
realize we can absolutely do it. But like I said, it's that unfailing persistence, and I think that's just the best word. I mean, I will say being an entrepreneur is hard. Like, you are making decisions every day, and in you're just like, oh, that's fine, I can make decisions. No, 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 really. If you've never been an entrepreneur, you don't realize the enormous number of decisions you're making every, and every single one of them, you're thinking to yourself, I don't know if this is the right thing. And of course, you know it's the right thing because you've never done it before. And so it's the very first time you're having to decide. I mean, it could be as simple as like, what color should I choose for my company's logo? Or what should my company's logo look like? To how am I funding this business? To where should I invest um, my first marketing budget? Or, what's my first product going to look like? Or how much should I invest in that first product? Or should I take this investment or should I take that investment? I mean, the gamut of decisions is mind-boggling. And so that's actually, I think, a lot of reasons why people don't persist. It's really hard. It's really hard to constantly be in a situation of complete unknown and then to be making these decisions as if you know exactly that that's the right thing that's going to take you to the next best space.
Right.
And business is always unknown. But when it's all on you as an entrepreneur, it can be super stressful. And so the ones that persist are the ones that can handle that pressure and that stress, and the ones that are ultimately going to be successful. So right now, Ola Martin, that looks like you. It's fantastic.
Well, I mean, like I mean, like I'll say this though, that I could never have done this alone, and I think that's a very key lesson. And I'm so glad to have so many great people around me, like foreign professors, like and partners and the team and advisors, right? That helping you making those decisions. But of course, at the end of the day, you have to, and I think like that's why I wanted to bring up the foundation. And I know you talk a lot about that in terms of the program, right? And it's sort of like how you build that. And we always say this, that I think a lot of the reasons why we're seeing what we're doing in terms of the decisions that we're making is that make sure that you build that solid foundation, because that's going to make the decisions that you make a lot easier. And I always tend to say this as well, that because people are like, oh, what is your most hardest challenges that you're doing now? And I said, I love the early days when all I was focusing on was how the logo was going to look like. That was nice. That was some nice days when that was my biggest challenge. But it's part of the growth, right? I mean, like when things are happening and the business are moving forward, like you will get harder decisions, and the bigger you become, the more challenges you will face. And so yes, it's hard, but the harder it becomes, sort of like the better it gets. It's kind of like that weird weird situation there when it's you want it to be harder, and then you can continue to grow because it means you're probably going in the right direction. And then
Mhm.
there's a lot of stuff that you learn. I mean, like we're literally in the middle of the funding process right now, and there's so much new stuff there that I had no idea like existed, and I'm just like I'm just soaking everything in, right? And just and even in that sense, like I'm glad I have people around me that knows this, that have been through this journey, and they can say, okay, this is some of the tips that we would provide, but at the end of the day, you have to make that decision, and that's what it comes down to. And I know we're going to
Mhm.
do a lot of mistakes, hopefully not as many big ones,
Right.
but it's about vouching for the decisions that you do, and that's where I think the foundation comes in as a very key element.
Definitely. Yeah. And you're right. You're always going to make mistakes. And that's the other thing that I think that allows a successful entrepreneur to keep going, is to allow themselves to know that it's okay to make mistakes, because there will always be decisions where you look back, you're like, oh, we should have done it the other way. But they always say hindsight is 2020. And it's as a decision maker, you don't have that privilege. We don't have a crystal ball, so we do the best with what we have and go forward from there. And I love that you're absolutely right what you just said, which is now that the decisions are harder, it's actually better because now you're in a much more successful place, like you're in a bigger place. That's why the decisions are harder. So it's a great sign. That's a perfect sign.
Yeah, it's that very almost like weird feeling where I think like people are like, oh, why is this getting harder? But then you just have to realize, well, if it's a lot harder, it just means you're going in the right direction. So it's part of the journey. But I think that kind of like makes us into the final question here, which I think it's just wrapping all the stuff that we talked about into like a final final, I guess, key tips and advice. But if you wanted to I guess we'll separate the questions a little bit and sort of like from first angle, looking into a little bit the crystal ball that you that you have from your perspective, I guess. What tips do you have for students out there sort of like right now in the space that are trying to break into the industry? And then secondly, how can the program, the USF Sport Management program, help them on their path?
So I think there's 3 things that I would recommend. The first is to build a skill set. And it can be any skill set that you want, preferably something that you're really good at and something that you really want to do. And what I mean by that is companies hire in silos. When they need somebody in the marketing department is hiring somebody to do marketing. And when they need somebody to do finance, the finance department is hiring somebody to do finance. Now, there's some companies that are organized differently, but for the most part, every single company that you're going to work for is organized that way in functional silos. You need to start building a skill set for either marketing or for finance or for event operations or whatever it happens to be that your passion is or wherever you want to be. So get experience in that. So that's the second thing, start getting experience. And that can be volunteering, it can be working, but you need to start showing that you have work experience where you're using that skill set. And so that's going to continue to allow you to obviously build and develop that skill set. And then the third thing is to talk to people. And I know that sounds maybe simplistic, but one, it starts to develop your confidence in the sport industry as one, and in business as a whole as one where you need to communicate with other people. You need to be willing to just pick up a phone or shoot off an email and not be afraid to do it. And the more you talk to people, the better you get at doing that, just building up those professional communication skills. But 2, talking to people gives you access. It gives you access to people who are decision makers, who may be hiring somebody in the future. I will tell you that the sport industry is small. It really is. Whatever part of the industry you decide to go in, 50% of the people are going to know each other or more. Like everybody is going to be connected at some level. And so the more you know those people, the better the opportunities are for you to eventually get a job or to move to a better company that you want to be in. But just knowing everyone builds your professional network and allows you so many more opportunities later on.
100%. No, I think, I mean, like, I say this a lot too, is that all the informational interviews that I did during the program, like, without me obviously thinking about it, but because I was like, okay, yeah, it's good for me to sort of like expand that network and gaining that knowledge and insights. Then once I started the company, I sort of like knew all these kind of people that I could now come back to and say, hey, I have this project that I'm working on. I want to hear your thoughts, and that's only created a lot of opportunities. I said I would not be where I am today without that. That was part of the foundation, and it's extremely important. And I guess like if you want to like highlight a little bit on like the program itself and how you guys are focusing on that, I think would be really nice to sort of like wrap things up with.
Well, I think you just illustrated it as well, but that's exactly what we ask our students to do. So we provide an enormous number of opportunities, job postings, internship postings, so people can get experience. We challenge you to build your own skill set, just because everyone is going to have their own unique passion, and that's up to you. But certainly the classwork that you're taking is going to help you build those skill sets. You can always go additional certifications and all these other things. And then, of course, the talking to people, that's what the program provides as well. Not only frameworks for doing these informational interviews like you talked about, but the access sometimes. So our alumni network is very deep and very broad. And so the connections, when you just start thinking about those trees of connectivity, our network can really get a lot of access to a lot of people that you want to have in your network, people that you want to talk to, people that you want to be part of your professional circle. And that's a really powerful tool that certainly that we offer.
And I mean, like from my personal side too of the program, I think, and speaking of that sort of like alumni network, and I know like I was a little bit worried about that in the beginning because I was, Norwegian coming to like, different country and all this stuff. And what I really enjoyed is sort of like, it was a very open alumni. It was sort of like, it didn't matter that I was like from Norway or wherever it was. It was just like, okay, you're a USF sport management student or like an alumni, happy to talk, right? So it's sort of like that, very helpful, mindset. And I think that goes back to like how you guys are, focusing on this during the program too, that, you're here to help each other. And again, like, I can't emphasize this enough too, like, with Rasher and with the thesis, like me having the opportunity to do my business plan, for Sporting Global on it, that made like, pretty much a lot of the foundation that we can sit on today. So I'm extremely grateful for that flexibility, for that, openness and community to sort of like start building your journey, wherever that is taking you, and having you guys around that to support, wherever that angle is, and opening those doors it's been an extremely key factor, I think, and will be a very key factor moving forward as well, because there's not only that, American community, it's a global community of sport management students that are across the world. And I always think it's super cool as well when I get like those informational interview requests from like some of your current students, and I'm like, whoa, cool. I'm being thought about. So I'm more than happy to help on that side, and it's always fun giving back. So I know how important it was for me, and I think that's a lot of the mindset that people bring with, and what is important in that program for sure.
Absolutely. It's really about paying it forward. And I always tell people, when we accept a student into our program, we're choosing them, we're wanting them to be a part of their team. There is something extraordinary about them already, and we help develop them into something even more extraordinary. And when they graduate, we are so thrilled to have them, as this permanent part of our alumni community. And we just know that they're going to be willing to give back, because that's the kind of person that we selected. We knew that they were that kind of person when we brought them in. And so we just absolutely love the community that we've developed, and can't wait to, continue growing it every single year with more and more students.
Absolutely. Well, with that, Nola, I think I would like to thank you so much, for taking the time, being part of the podcast, sharing your insights and your story. I think it was a pleasure having you here. And like I said, thank you so much for taking the time.
Oh, it was great being here. Thanks so much for inviting me back.
Absolutely, Nola. And to wrap it up, I got to teach you some Norwegian.
Okay, let's do it.
Yeah, so with every video we do, we always finish with "Vi snakkes."
Vi snakkes.
There you go, which means see you later in Norwegian. So now you know some Norwegian as well.
Vi snakkes.
Vi snakkes.